At a campaign in Milwaukee, a deranged, out-of-work bartender emerged from the crowd and shot Theodore Roosevelt point blank in the chest. Staggered by the impact of the bullet, the great man nevertheless righted himself and insisted that he would go on to deliver his speech. Many of his aides wanted to rush him to the hospital, but Theodore Roosevelt merely waved them aside. "It's either the speech or I die, one or the other. I'm going to deliver this speech," he said. When Roosevelt arrived at the rally, he went on to deliver his speech to the people there for over 2.5 hours. After he delivered his speech, he was taken to the hospital, and he later recovered. This is just a story that I took from a biography that I read a couple years ago on the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and I think it just illustrates some of the great quality and the character that he had. Many of you know that he was the 26th President of the United States, and he was a man of great character. And I'd just like to talk about some of his life for just a few minutes here as we look at and analyze the life of this man who was our 26th President. Theodore Roosevelt was a great president for our country. His leadership and his testimony are a great model for us to follow today. In just the next minutes, we'd like to just look at his life and some of the things that God did through his life to impact our country. First of all, let's look at his presidency. When you think of his presidency, there are just a few accomplishments that we can go over. Theodore Roosevelt was responsible for the construction of the Panama Canal, and that alone is just such a great feat as we look back at our nation's history. The Panama Canal has affected our country in some great ways, as well as Middle America and so many other countries around the world. Not only was he responsible for that, but Theodore Roosevelt also received the Nobel Peace Prize for helping to negotiate peace in the Russo-Japanese War. One of the other great feats that God used Theodore Roosevelt to do was he helped to reestablish our country as the #1 military power in the world. So now that we've looked at Theodore Roosevelt, his presidency, let's next look at his leadership. One of the things that was so true about Theodore Roosevelt was that he really led by example. And even as you think back on that story of where he was shot and even insisted on delivering that speech because he was so selfless, he was really a person who put actions behind his words. And I think that's a neat thing that we think about when you look at leadership. He was a person who led by example, put action behind his words. And one of the things he's also famous for was leading the charge at the Battle of San Juan during the Spanish-American War. There was so much courage and character behind this man that we can be encouraged as we think about the type of leadership example he leaves for us today. So now that we've looked at his presidency and also his leadership, let's lastly look at his testimony. When you look at the testimony of Theodore Roosevelt, one of the things you notice is that God really used tragedy to shape who he was as a person. Theodore Roosevelt's first wife, after she had given birth to she and Theodore's first child, only 2 days after that she died, and on that same day Theodore Roosevelt's mother also died from illnesses. Theodore Roosevelt was someone who was used of God to be shaped through tragedy, and during that time he went through some real struggles. One of the things that you also notice in Theodore Roosevelt's great testimony was that he was passionately committed to his family. These are things that I just found from whitehouse.gov as it gives a brief biography on Theodore Roosevelt's life. He was really passionately committed to his second wife and his 6 children, and there's a lot of neat stories that just talk about him hiking through the trails of mountains, spending time in his busy life, and even in his presidency, taking time for his second wife and his kids, and making sure that they were a priority in his life. Now that we've looked at just the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, his leadership, and his testimony, let's just wrap things up as we think about the model and the example that he leaves for us today. It's been almost 90 years since he died, but his work and his testimony are still a great challenge to us today as we think about things like integrity, leadership, and even just making sure that our actions line up with our words. I hope that this time has been an encouragement to you as you think about how the Lord wants to use your life and your testimony to be someone who influences other people in the day-to-day work that you do. Thank you.